Okay, so picture this. It's 1774, and the British Parliament passes a set of laws that American colonists immediately label the Intolerable Acts. I mean, to them, this was pure tyranny. But just across the border, some people saw those exact same laws as a blessing. And for others still, they were the beginning of a story of absolute betrayal. All right, let's get into it.
So here's the puzzle we're going to unpack. How on earth could one set of laws be seen so differently by so many people? How could something be both intolerable and, well, a godsend? The answer, it turns out, reveals not just the spark of the American Revolution, but the very creation of modern Canada.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to break it all down by looking at 5 key angles. The initial spark in Boston, the outrage from the American colonies, the very surprising view from French Quebec, the tragic fallout for First Nations, and finally, the birth of a whole new English-speaking Canada. First up, let's set the scene. Tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies had been simmering for years, but one famous party in Boston brought everything to a rolling boil. This was really a decade of one thing after another. It started with taxes, like the Stamp Act, which then boiled over into actual violence at the Boston Massacre. And then finally, it just detonated with the Boston Tea Party in 1773. That's when colonists, famously dumped a massive fortune in British tea right into the harbor. For the British Parliament, that was it. That was the final straw. And this slogan, it absolutely nails the core of the colonists' fury. Their argument was simple. Parliament had no right to tax them because they didn't have any elected representatives in London. For them, it wasn't really about the money. It was about a fundamental violation of their rights as British subjects. And Britain's response was swift, and it was severe. They passed what they called the Coercive Acts. They shut down Boston Harbor, the lifeblood of the city's economy, until every last drop of that tea was paid for. They revoked the colony's charter, basically dissolving its government and putting it under direct military rule. They even said any British official accused of a capital crime would be sent all the way to England for trial. The message was crystal clear. Mess with us, and we will crush you. But it wasn't just the punishment of Boston that sent the Americans over the edge. Right around the same time, Parliament passed another law, the Quebec Act. And the colonists, well, they immediately lumped it in with all the others, seeing it as the ultimate intolerable act. Now, what's so fascinating is that the Quebec Act wasn't technically part of the crackdown on Boston at all. It was a totally separate law, meant to figure out how to govern the territory of Quebec. But for the American patriots, the timing, the content, it just smelled like part of the same grand tyrannical plan. So take a look at this map, because this is absolutely crucial. The Quebec Act dramatically blew up the borders of Quebec, pushing them way down south into the Ohio Valley. For colonists in places like Virginia, who had their own claims and big dreams of expanding west, this was a massive economic blow. It was like Britain had just slammed gate shut on their entire future. So for the colonists, this thing was like a trifecta of tyranny. First, it completely blocked their westward expansion. Second, it set up a government right on their border that didn't have an elected assembly, which you can imagine they saw as a terrifying preview of what might happen to them. And third, and this was a huge deal for the deeply Protestant colonies, it gave official recognition and freedom to the Catholic Church. It felt like a direct threat right on their doorstep. Okay, so let's shift gears and head north, because this is where the story gets really wild. The very same act that the American colonists saw as this terrible tool of oppression was actually seen by the French-speaking people in Quebec as a revolutionary act of protection. And this just lays it out perfectly. Down in the 13 colonies, the Quebec Act was intolerable. But up in Quebec, for the French Canadians, the Canadiens, it was basically their version of the Magna Carta. It was a promise that their entire way of life would be preserved under British rule. I mean, think about what this act delivered. It guaranteed religious freedom for Catholics, a right they didn't even fully have back in Britain at the time. It brought back their traditional French civil law for things like property. It was this incredibly pragmatic deal. The British Crown basically said to the French Canadians, look, you can keep your language, you can keep your religion, and you can keep your laws. It was a promise of cultural survival. So you can imagine, when the Continental Congress sent letters north trying to get the French Canadians to join their revolution, the answer was a pretty resounding, no thanks. As one American diplomat put it, they chose to stand neuter. And why wouldn't they? Why join a rebellion led by anti-Catholic colonists who were screaming about the very rights you were just granted, when the British had just promised to protect everything you held dear,
It just didn't make any sense. But there was a third group, caught right in the middle of this imperial showdown, the First Nations of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes. And for them, the consequences of these acts and the war that followed would be nothing short of catastrophic.
Let's go back to that map again. Remember how the colonists saw that new Quebec border as a wall blocking their ambition? Well, many indigenous nations saw it as a potential shield. By putting that territory under British control from Quebec, it created, in theory, a buffer zone, something to protect their ancestral lands from the relentless flood of American settlers. This all led to what you could call an alliance of necessity. Powerful groups like the Iroquois Confederacy overwhelmingly sided with the British. Their goal was simple: survival. They figured a British victory was their only shot at stopping American expansion and holding on to their lands. And these alliances were critical, giving the British skilled warriors to conduct raids all along the American frontier. But then the war ended. The British made peace. And in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, they just handed over all the territory east of the Mississippi, including the ancestral homelands of their own indigenous allies, directly to the new United States. And here's the most devastating part. They did it without a single one of their allies at the negotiating table, without even consulting them. It was a complete and utter betrayal.
The human cost of this was immediate, and it was immense. Entire nations were dispossessed overnight. Thousands of people, Mohawks, Micmacs, Algonquins, and many others who had fought and bled for the British crown, were forced to abandon their homes and become refugees, fleeing north to seek whatever sanctuary they could find in British North America.
And that brings us to our final group, whose story is tied directly to the outcome of this revolution: the American Loyalists. Their mass exodus would fundamentally reshape the future of Canada forever. Look at this number: 50,000. Just let that sink in for a second. That's the estimated number of American colonists who stayed loyal to the king and were then forced to flee the new United States. And where did the biggest group of them end up? You guessed it, they headed north to what would become Canada. And we're not just talking about a bunch of aristocrats here. These were farmers, shopkeepers, soldiers, families from every single walk of life. Their arrival wasn't just an influx of people. It was like transplanting an entire society, one that had a deep, deep suspicion of that brand new American experiment to the South. The impact was just transformative. This flood of English-speaking refugees completely changed the country's demographics. It was so overwhelming that a whole new colony, New Brunswick, was created in 1784 just to find a place for them all. This shift led directly to the Constitutional Act of 1791, which split the old province of Quebec right in two: a French-speaking Lower Canada, which is modern Quebec, and a new English-speaking Upper Canada, which became Ontario. They literally drew the borders of modern Canada, and they established a conservative, anti-American political tradition that would shape the country for generations. Which brings us to a final, really interesting thought. The Intolerable Acts sparked a revolution for independence in the South, but through this wild chain of protection, betrayal, and migration, those exact same acts laid the foundation for a profoundly different nation in the North. So you have to ask yourself, was the American Revolution just an American story? Or was it also, in its own complicated, accidental way, a Canadian creation story too?